Pride and Prejudice and Planets, an alternate reality Pride and Prejudice science fiction variation by Renata McMann and Summer Hanford. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. The Enemy. Cassandra floated high above Earth in a small, cloaked vessel, the ship locked in an endless elliptical orbit. Little power was used to avoid detection by the dominant species below. Cassandra wondered for how much longer watching like this would be possible. The human creatures, as they dubbed themselves, were on the upward arc of technology, the apex of which would either unleash vast new potential for their race, or spell their doom, except that they would never reach that apex. At some point in that arc, Cassandra and her fellows would intervene again, as they always did, as they had many times before on this world and others. This saddened Cassandra somewhat, for, stationed here for hundreds of turns about the region's sun, Cassandra had come to enjoy watching the vibrant planet. Cassandra was not the being's original designation, and she had no gender. The one who had programmed her had stipulated that Cassandra select a designation from the planet she studied and identify with that designation to encourage understanding of the dominant species. For this Earth planet, she chose the name Cassandra from a Greek legend. She enjoyed the irony of the name because the Greek Cassandra was a prophet no one believed, while she was a prophet no one saw or heard. That she was a prophet, Cassandra had no doubt. She knew much of the future of this world because she had studied many worlds. Intelligent species inevitably followed the same path. The humans of Earth were no different, which was why she and her fellows had already intervened several times, usually in the form of forced evolution through the release of engineered viruses. Sometimes those viruses had been too effective. Therefore, Cassandra now had a disease ready that would kill few, but would leave people with tremors. That lasting debilitation would call attention in a way that a deadly disease wouldn't. The only thing they lacked was a small, isolated group of humans on whom to test her new invention. The name humans used for their species, Homo sapiens, was typical of intelligent life. Their name was derived from ancient forms of verbal communication on their home planet, and could be loosely translated as, "We're the only species around that's worth anything." It had been much the same on the world Cassandra could mostly call home. The name for the beings she came from also went well with their history of killing off more than 99% of the species on the planet on which they had evolved. Not simply for food, safety, or even sport, but for baser motivations like fear and greed. The race that created Cassandra had killed off 3 distinct branches of their own species, and all the intelligent species on 2 other planets. Cassandra's makers had then decided that such behavior was becoming too uncontrolled, troublesome even. A small conclave, the sole survivors of their destructive species, made the decision to relegate their descendants to a zoo-like situation. They would be allowed to shine in music, art, poetry, dancing, and storytelling, but never be given the opportunity to learn the science and technology that might allow them to challenge the rule of Cassandra and her fellows. Still, those in captivity were at times given the chance to die for the sake of their newfound peace, as a tribute to their too malleable, volatile nature. For there were still opportunities to die, if not on their world, then on others and among the stars. the destruction of other races had not gone unnoticed in their corner of the galaxy. Their sordid history became entangled with other species who traveled the stars. This brought more trouble, and more names. Ones not of their choosing. Names that translated into one of the dominant human languages as words like ravagers, destroyers, poisoners, despicable ones. A signal came from another of Cassandra's colleagues, interrupting her musings on how other races viewed her own. The indicator identified the caller as Austen, who had watched with Cassandra for a time and who had elected to be male. Speaking in their language, Cassandra said, "Open channel," and the ship's computer complied, as all good technology should. The ship's computer wasn't self-aware like Cassandra, on the off chance the vessel was ever captured and studied. "Your report says the Euchres have made contact with the Earthlings," Austen said with no preamble. Cassandra enjoyed irrelevant greetings before non-urgent business, a habit which she had learned from centuries of watching the humans, but understood that Austen had watched for only a short time and had no comprehension of these niceties. "Yes." "What is the Euchre objective?" Keeping to the facts, Cassandra said, "The usual with an unusual twist. They are getting better at approaching other races. They have communicated from orbit, out of range of any weapons currently available on Earth. They have offered to give Earth 6 FTL ships, and to teach the humans to make their own ships with FTL technology. The Euchres would readily hand over faster-than-light technology to so volatile a race." Austen did not sound pleased. "On what condition? That they ally against us?" "No." This time Cassandra employed brevity for the amusement of aggravating Austen, rather than out of respect for the other's laconic preferences. When Austen simply waited, Cassandra continued, "They hope the humans will attract enough of our attention to take the pressure off them, and—" "And what?" Austen barked, when Cassandra trailed off. "The only condition is that no harm will come to the Euchres sent to Earth as part of the exchange." This condition confused Cassandra, for surely the Euchres must realize the humans were too volatile a race to uphold such a condition. "The Euchres must know we will intervene." "Undoubtedly," Cassandra said with no emotion. It was unfortunate, but true. They would intervene. Cassandra looked down at the pretty, slowly spinning white, blue, tan, and green planet with resignation. The humans had a saying, "All good things come to an end." With more empathy than Cassandra generally credited to the other conclave member, Austen asked, "When the Earthlings realize that FTL technology makes them targets, won't they resent the Euchres?" "Perhaps, but the Euchres made no pretense about that. They told the humans about us, the truth as they know it." Austen made a sardonic sound. "What name did they give us?" "The Euchre one. In human it translates to the enemy." In truth, less disparaging than many other names the conclave species had received. Why would the Earthlings accept becoming targets? There was a human saying for that as well, so Cassandra replied, "The chance to obtain FTL technology is an offer they can't refuse." Chapter 2. Journey's Start, nearly 2 decades later. Darcy toured the HMS Derbyshire, scrutinizing every detail. She was his first ship, and at 30, He felt the pressure of being given such a weighty responsibility. Not many pilots made captain in the British Intergalactic Force, or BIF, so young. He recorded as he went, so he could continue to look over his ship while in his quarters that evening. So far, he liked what he saw and couldn't imagine what might need changing prior to their maiden voyage. But he required everything to be perfect, from the neatly arrayed conduits revealed by opening various panels about the ship, to the food stocked in their minuscule galley, and especially him and his 9-person crew, 10 being all FTL ships could carry. Finally satisfied for the time being, Darcy reluctantly disengaged the Derbyshire's auxiliary power and vacated the vessel. He shucked the jumpsuit he had worn for the inspection, though the Derbyshire was so clean that not a drop of oil or smudge of grease marked the garment. Donning civilian clothes, he made his way out of the restricted area of the hangar and down to ground transport. Darcy crossed a garage full of electric ground vehicles that held no excitement for an FTL pilot, his mind still roaming the corridors of his ship. After a moment, he realized that one of the other people in the garage walked in his direction, with purpose. Another second passed before Darcy grasped that the man was Charles Bingley. Darcy raised a hand in greeting to his longtime friend, waiting until they met halfway across the garage to say, "Bingley, what brings you here? Or is it classified business for the ambassador?" Bingley grinned, excitement glinting in his gaze. "Not for the ambassador, but for myself." Darcy's eyebrows shot up. "You've been promoted. Congratulations are in order." If getting a ship at 30 was young, gaining an ambassadorship at 29 was unheard of. But then Charles Bingley had been born for the role. Bingley shook his head, his cheer undimmed. "I haven't actually received an ambassadorial appointment, but I have resigned my post as assistant attaché for the time being. I'm here to arrange for my first and probably last assignment." "Probably last?" Darcy shook his head. "That begs for clarification. Are we due a celebratory pint or not?" "I wasn't appointed or assigned. Rather, to be more accurate, I assigned myself." Enthusiasm animated Bingley's expression. "I think we could have better relations with the Ukers, and I've been persistent enough about the idea that the Foreign Office finally said I could spend my own money and try. They detailed what I can offer the Ukers, and they'll reimburse me if I succeed. I'm here to see what it takes to arrange transportation to Takatara, so I can begin to put together a budget and crew." Takatara, home of the Ukers, a somewhat humanoid race, with striped grey skin, a long tail, 3-fingered hands, and a designation that always reminded Darcy of cards with his grandfather. It was pronounced Euchre. More than home to the Ukers, Takatara was also the planet that had swallowed up 2 of Darcy's cousins on the Fitzwilliam side, Richard and Mary. The planet where Richard died. Darcy pressed that grim thought from his mind and said, "That seems like an auspicious deal for the Foreign Office. They can't lose." And even Bingley might not be able to win. There had been distrust between humans and Ukers ever since the Uke desertion. "I'm sure that's why the Foreign Office said yes. They come out ahead no matter what, unless I start an intergalactic incident." Bingley added a chuckle for his joke before continuing. "Trying to restore relations with the Ukers is bound to be a lot more interesting than attending endless parties and organizing the ambassador's schedule." "But you're paying for everything." Bingley shrugged. "Only if I fail, and I can afford it." True enough. Bingley and his sisters might be first generation at Cambridge, not like those in Darcy's line, but their father's success in business meant that what they lacked in pedigree they more than made up for with money, especially Bingley. His parents had divided their fortune equally, but his childless great-uncle, who had been even more successful than Bingley's father, had left everything to his only grandnephew. But even if Bingley could afford to take on better relations with Takatara on behalf of the Foreign Office, Darcy worried that his friend was being set up for failure. Since fleeing Earth nearly 20 years ago, the Ukers had rejected every overture. "Are you certain you're not taking on an impossible task?" "I've been studying Ukers for years. I think our approach has been wrong." Darcy frowned. "What approach should we take? Kowtow to them?" Bingley shook his head. "We should respect their beliefs and emphasize what values we share. Isn't that what diplomats do? You can't be the first to come up with the idea." Bingley's amiable expression didn't waver. "The theory is easy to understand. It's the execution where past attempts have been lacking." "Well, if anyone can properly execute the idea, you can." Darcy gestured back the way he had come. "How about I introduce you to a few pilots and captains, so you can begin negotiating your travel arrangements?" "I thought you would never offer," Bingley replied with a grin. "And then we can go for that celebratory drink." "Sure thing," Darcy said, and started back for the hangar, Bingley in step. After their drink, which included several toasts to Darcy's captaincy as well, he didn't see Charles Bingley for 8 months. A pilot-frequented pub on Brighton 4 wasn't exactly the last place Darcy had expected to run into his friend, but it certainly was a surprise. Enough of one that, exhausted as Darcy was, he blinked rapidly to ensure Bingley wasn't a mirage created by his tired mind. Apparently real, Bingley waved. Seeing him there did make some sense, Darcy reflected, as Bingley strode across the tap-room in his direction. After all, there were plenty of Ukers on Brighton 4. It was a planet the Uker race had terraformed, and, unlike their home planet of Takatara, all members of the Alliance were welcome, even humans. "Bingley, well met," Darcy greeted when Bingley reached him. "What brings you to Brighton 4? He gestured to an empty seat. "When last we spoke, you were starting arrangements for a mission to Takatara. You didn't end up going?" "Yes, I did. I just haven't made it there yet. Our captain, Perry, suffered a ruptured appendix. We had some luck in that there's a human doctor here who operated. Perry's out of danger, but both the human and Uker doctors agree that he's not going anywhere anytime soon, so far, neither have we." "That's rotten luck. Perry's a good pilot." He was the best of the 3 Darcy had recommended to Bingley the last time they met. "I'll have to visit him after I get some sleep." "You look like you need it," Bingley observed with less tact than he would employ with most people. "Late night?" Darcy pushed a hand through his hair, feeling even more tired than he imagined he looked. He had only stopped to grab a quick bite before sleeping. "I wish that were all. Sleep's been a memory, I'm afraid. We've had months of fighting in the Allenham system." Bingley nodded. "I'm lucky to find you here, then, but I won't keep you. We can catch up after your rest." "Nonsense." Darcy raised his voice slightly to be heard over the din of the tavern. "My food isn't even here yet. I welcome the company. I'd rather talk than fall asleep in my chair." Bingley offered a quick grin at that. He waved over a server and placed his order before turning back to say, "So, what brings you back from Allenham? Nothing too dire, I trust. From what I've heard, the Alliance did well there." "We did, but I had to give up a pilot to a ship that made a sudden turn after one of its inertia cancellers was destroyed." The ship they could repair, but 4 members of the crew died, including 2 of their 3 pilots. Bingley grimaced. He had gone into diplomacy, in large part due to a lack of stomach for war. And the enemy? News is they were defeated. Yes, we won. Darcy reported with quiet satisfaction. There are no signs that the enemy is still in the system. It was a hard-fought victory, but it pushed back the enemy and brought the Allenhamites firmly into the alliance. They'd been wavering for nearly a decade. Bingley's drink arrived then, and he waited until the server retreated before raising his glass to Darcy. 2 hard-fought victories and new alliances. Darcy returned the salute. He downed a gulp of dark ale and set down his glass. He wanted food more than drink. Bingley took a long swallow before asking, "But why are you so tired? Surely you had a chance to rest between the Allenham system and here. For that matter, what are you doing on Brighton 4? Since I had a free slot after loaning out my pilot, I was asked to ferry a Northanger named Reynolds to Brighton 4. Reynolds wanted to see the results of terraforming. It is an impressive sight, Bingley said, looking about the tap-room, though little could be seen through the crowd and the cloudy windows. I don't know of any other planet that has been successfully terraformed. I don't either. It took them 900 years, I've been told. It's amazing to start a project that will take so long to bring results, especially since they could only bring a few euchres at a time to settle it. Interest brought greater animation to Bingley's features. Yes, they lived in domes at first, and they still have several up and running in case they require quarantine bubbles, and for what they call O2 vacations, because the oxygen level is still a bit low here. It's generally not an issue, of course, because most of the settlements are only a few hundred meters above sea level. But you haven't answered my question. Darcy blinked, his mind foggy with lack of sleep. The server returned, sliding a plate of what was meant to be fish and chips onto the table before him. The fish was actually some sort of plant-based material, though the potatoes were authentic. Oddly, Earth potatoes were known throughout Alliance territories for their ability to adapt to other planets, and for other races' capacity to utilize them, though not always as food. He'd heard the Kellynchers used them for sport. Darcy reached for the vinegar. I haven't answered your question? About why you're so tired? Oh, right. We were almost here when we received a distress call from a euchre ship. When we answered it, we were attacked. I managed to avoid the worst of the initial assault, but several of my crew were injured during the evasive maneuvers, including my backup pilot. No one died, but I was the only pilot in any shape to man the ship. Were you able to assist the euchres? Bingley asked with obvious worry. Darcy nodded and shoved a chip in his mouth. The server appeared again, this time with Bingley's order of a euchre dish that looked to Darcy like nothing so much as a bowl of seasoned fish eyes. Bingley thanked the server, then spooned some of the globes into his mouth. Darcy could hear them popping loudly as Bingley chewed. If his expression was any indication, the fish eyes were good. Bingley swallowed, took a swig of beer, and said, So we're both short on crew. It's worse than that. We destroyed the enemy ship, but we took a lot of damage doing so. Knocked out our FTL drive. It took us days to get here, and since arriving, all I've done is go over the Derbyshire with the euchre mechanics here. This is the first chance I've had for a meal since we landed. Or to rest. So you piloted for how many days straight? Only 2 straight. At one point I gave in to Reynolds, the Northanger, for a few hours. Reynolds claims to be a pilot, but doesn't have credentials, so I was loath to do it. But It finally convinced me that a pilot who couldn't see straight for lack of sleep was more dangerous than an uncertified one. Darcy ate another chip. It always seemed strange to call Northangers it, but that was what they preferred. Northangers were androgen. "How is the Euchre ship doing?" Bingley asked, taking another bite of his fish-eye-looking food. "No casualties, and only minor damage. Everyone is being very helpful and treating us as heroes, but we'll be stuck here for at least 6 weeks, until enough bones are healed, even assuming we get new parts for the FTL drive in that time, and I'll still be down the pilot I loaned out, since we were supposed to return to Earth," which meant more long shifts and lost sleep when they headed to Earth to collect her, as a qualified pilot must always be at the helm. Bingley frowned slightly, his expression thoughtful, then said, "I still have my crew. Louisa and Hurst are with me, you'll recall." Darcy nodded and reached for another chip. Bingley's sister, Louisa Hurst, and her husband Stephen were solid crew members. Both were trained FTL pilots, but not members of the BIF. Louisa had gone to flight school after Cambridge and met Stephen Hurst there. Louisa was certified to be a second pilot, and Hurst a first. Combined with Perry, they made a better-than-average crew. Their skills were such that Bingley hiring them made enough sense not to smack too deeply of nepotism, especially as he was the one funding his venture. Not that Darcy would have made the same choice, but then, he was sensitive to anything that appeared to be favoritism. His parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins' notoriety always made him suspect of special treatment, which in turn caused him to work harder than anyone else. There could be no doubt that he'd earned what he had achieved. "It certainly sounds like your crew is due a bit of leave time, even the ones who are fit," Bingley was saying. "Would they enjoy some time on Brighton 4, do you think? With the damage to the Derbyshire and the injuries, they're going to have to stay on Brighton 4 for now, but the Euchres have assured us their expenses will be covered." Bingley grinned and reached for his beer. "In that case, I think I can negotiate a deal you might like." "I'll like any deal that sees me fed and asleep in the next 45 minutes. "Well then, stop talking and eat," Bingley said, gesturing to Darcy's plate. With a shrug, Darcy started on his fish, too tired to ask what Bingley had in mind, but certain he would find out soon enough. After his meal, during which Bingley rambled amiably about Brighton 4, Takatara, and Euchre society, Darcy returned to his small room in the quarters provided to him and his crew, and all but fell into his bed. Seconds later, a persistent chiming sound dragged him from sleep. Chapter 3. Meeting the Crew. Fumbling with his patch to stop the chiming, Darcy blinked rapidly to clear sand from his eyes and took in the time. Not seconds, then. Nearly 3 hours later. 3 hours was far less sleep than he wanted. He tapped his patch. Bingley's cheerful face materialized before him, as real as if Bingley himself were there, although disembodied. Darcy stifled a groan of dismay for his interrupted sleep, and played the message. "Darcy, I think I can negotiate a deal that will get us to Takatara, and give your crew a well-deserved rest. Call me when you wake up." 3 hours wasn't enough time to get a message to Takatara or Earth, much less get one back. Bingley must have found someone with the authority to negotiate. He must also assume that Darcy wanted to go to Takatara. Had they talked about that at dinner? Darcy remembered nodding a lot while he ate. If he had agreed, he would sort it out come morning, or whatever he felt qualified as such. He closed Bingley's message, rolled over to face the wall, closed his eyes, and went back to sleep. Some 6 hours later, a call to Bingley revealed that Darcy had indeed agreed not simply to travel to Takatara if Bingley could arrange it, but to captain Bingley's ship, replacing Perry. And arrange it Bingley had, right down to sending messages to Earth, suggesting that since Darcy couldn't return to Earth, he might as well spend some time on Takatara. There he could exchange information with Euchres to the benefit of both. The Euchres sweetened the pot by offering Darcy's crew remote courses through Meryton Mechanics and Pilot University. Messages between Takatara and Brighton 4 took several hours, so there would be no live content, but lectures were available, and work could be graded. Credit for even one remote course from such a prestigious institution would be a desirable addition to anyone's resume. Not such a bad deal for Darcy and his crew. Without a ship of his own, Darcy had no real duties on Brighton 4, and after the time he had put in fighting the enemy in the Allenham system, he could use a break from combat. What better non-combat duty could there be than visiting an allied world few humans had yet to see, even one that brought up some unpleasant memories? He summoned his crew to the central living space that connected their quarters, so he could make an inspection and give them the news. The two who remained bedridden were, of course, exempt from appearing in person, but were each put on a monitor, as their presence was required. Darcy's inspection revealed, as he'd already known it would, that, aside from the 2 bedridden crew members, another 2 were walking wounded. The 4 who'd been buckled in, as Darcy had, were relatively unscathed. Unfortunately, Darcy's second-in-command wasn't in that category. He'd broken his left arm and his right hand. The bone in his hand would take months to heal, none of which seemed to bother him or the rest, once they heard Darcy's news. The crew was happy about the courses, and were soon busily looking through the list of what was available. Leaving them to it, Darcy went to his quarters to pack a bag he'd hardly unloaded. After packing, which took less than 10 minutes, Darcy sent a missive to Earth to let his younger sister, Georgiana, know of his change in plans. The change wouldn't impact her, as she was away at Rodion. But with both their parents dead, he was her guardian and felt she should know where he could be found. He then sent a communique to the BIF, explaining his actions. Since it would be 2 months before Earth could respond, he had latitude to make decisions. Lastly, he sent word to his loaned-out pilot to let her know that the HMS Derbyshire would not be returning to Earth any time soon. Darcy then sought out Hangar 1032 to make his inspection of the Netherfield. He found her to be not as new, large, or fully equipped as the Derbyshire, but a space-worthy vessel nonetheless. She would handle well. In the quarters he was assigned on the Netherfield, previously Perry's, waited a data drive containing Bingley's briefing on their mission. Familiar with such material from his assignment in the Allenham system, Darcy uploaded the data, wondering if he would really need it. Before his mission in their system, Darcy had used all his free time to learn about Allenhamites. But once there, he'd never set foot on Allenham. He'd only landed at a colony on a Mars-like planet in their system, when in need of supplies, and the bay he'd used had been staffed by the BIF. Still, they were meant to actually land on Takatara. Darcy opened the file. Skimming revealed the briefing to be comprehensive and meticulous in the extreme. Between his shifts at the helm and sleep, he would never make it through all the material Bingley had provided before they finished their 5-day trip. He respected Bingley's attention to detail, but he wished the briefing titled Ambassador Bingley's report on everything a diplomatic envoy should know about Takatara prior to landing there was, well, brief. Even the title was ridiculously long and detailed, and the little Darcy had read revealed that Bingley's enthusiasm for euchres came through with unsubtle clarity, despite obvious attempts to be dry and impartial. Darcy stowed his duffel, not wanting to unpack until he had familiarized himself with everything important. Although he had flown this type of ship before, the interior of this vessel was very different. Bingley had turned a ship that carried 7 people tightly into a ship that carried 5 in, well, not luxury but comfort, using the weight allotment that would have been made up by more crew members to bring in far more lavish furnishings than usually found on an FTL ship. Once Darcy felt satisfied that there had been no changes to the flight deck or controls, he went back down to his quarters. He unpacked and looked longingly at his bunk. Really, he shouldn't need more sleep. Frowning, he checked the time. He went up to the flight deck again to find Louisa and Stephen Hurst chatting with Bingley. "Isn't it time for our pre-flight check?" "Caroline isn't here," Bingley replied. "She's on her way and should be here in 20 minutes. "Caroline?" Darcy repeated. Bingley nodded. "Yes, she's late." "She, as in your younger sister, Caroline." Even sleep-deprived as he'd been in the pub, Darcy knew Bingley hadn't mentioned that Caroline would accompany them. "She's my diplomatic assistant and backup pilot," Bingley muttered, his downcast expression all the evidence Darcy needed to understand that her presence had been deliberately withheld. "Wonderful," Darcy said dryly. At Cambridge, Bingley's younger sister had made numerous unsubtle advances on Darcy, who simply was not interested. Not only that, he had heard Caroline spout some pretty outlandish anti-alien rhetoric. Is hiring her a good idea with some of her views on other species? Her views on other species are one of the reasons I brought her. Bingley's countenance lit with enthusiasm. Among other things, once she is on another world and sees how amazing it is to be among other sapient beings, with their different cultures and mores, she'll realize how silly that drivel she watches on the internet is. Will she? Darcy countered, half wishing he hadn't agreed to join the expedition. Yes, it was a better option than staying on Brighton 4, despite the courses being offered. "She will," Bingley said with conviction, "and she'll arrive soon." "We can do our pre-flight check then," Darcy said, resigned to what he couldn't change. "I assume she knows when we are scheduled to leave?" The Hursts exchanged a glance Darcy couldn't interpret, so he ignored it and carefully went through the check. When he finished, 6 minutes remained before their scheduled departure. The time ticked by slowly, but Caroline didn't arrive. A call came from the control tower, and Darcy answered as if it was saying a crew member was missing and they would wait for the next slot. "We're pretty busy. It will be about 2 hours, the tower said. "Understood," Darcy replied without acrimony. It wasn't the tower's fault. After closing the channel, he turned to Bingley. "I usually like to personally check the essentials before leaving. I should have time." "I've done it myself, resupplying here," Bingley said. "Fuel, oxygen, water, complete medical kit, food for a month. Don't worry about it." If Bingley said he'd done it, it was done. Darcy adjusted the monitor to watch the bay doors and adjusted. 15 minutes later, Caroline Bingley sauntered through the bay doors. She was dressed very fashionably, with high-heeled shoes that were ridiculously unsuited to an FTL ship, and carried numerous shopping bags. Her overburdened arms disturbed Darcy more than her slow progress. Even with fewer crew members, he couldn't imagine how that many items didn't put her over her weight limit. Maybe she'd brought consumable goods on the first leg of their trip, or offloaded items on Brighton 4 to make a room for new ones. None of the four of them moved from their positions, allowing Caroline to stow her bags without help. When she came up to the flight deck, no one said anything.
"Captain Darcy, it's wonderful to see you. When Charles told me the news that you of all people would be assisting us in reaching Takatara, I was overjoyed."
She lowered her lids in a smouldering sort of way that made her look like someone had drugged her cappuccino.
"I simply had to go shopping for all new things and get my hair done."
She lightly patted her elaborate coiffure.
"Do you like it? It took me forever to find a human hairdresser. That's why I'm so late. But it was well worth the trouble, don't you think?"
Darcy did her the courtesy of actually looking at her hair for a moment. He, the Hursts, and Bingley all kept their hair in easy-to-maintain styles for the practicality of extended travel and limited water supplies. "It looks like it will require a great deal of maintenance." Caroline laughed, as if he'd been extremely witty, instead of dryly unimpressed.
"Of course, that's the point."
She gave him another smile, then turned a frown on her brother.
"Why aren't we going? Are they late as usual?"
"We lost our time slot because you were late," Hurst said. Darcy felt Hurst was being unusually tactful by not emphasizing the word you.
"They should give us the next one. Ambassador Bingley is important enough to bump someone."
"We will wait our turn," Bingley said. "We have more than an hour and a half before we take off."
"Well, then it doesn't matter that I was late. I'll go unpack my purchases. Let me know when they finally get around to letting us go. It's really outrageous how the aliens make us wait."
Darcy let out a long sigh. Travelling among the stars, a new-to-him world at the end, was the only thing that could make nearly a week locked in a ship with Caroline Bingley bearable. Chapter 4. Damage. 2 days into their journey, and off-duty, Darcy stretched out on his bunk in his quarters, and reluctantly brought up Bingley's report. He'd exhausted the excuses of using his free time to familiarize himself with the ship and catching up on sleep. Likewise, he'd already gone over their itinerary, which, predictably, kept them in Takatara's capital region. A quick bout of research, another acceptable foray into procrastination, had revealed that the famed Euchre flight simulators weren't kept there, but rather at the Meriton Mechanics and Pilot University in Hertford, which made sense. And now he was about to land the Netherfield on the Euchre homeworld, and he still knew little about them or their planet. He hadn't studied the Euchres since a course at Cambridge, which had covered all 16 sapient, non-human species. There had been plenty of information about members of the Alliance, but little about the enemy. Nevertheless, he realized that what he'd learned had to be superficial. After all, how much could someone know about humans from 2 or 3 lectures? Although Darcy wasn't part of Bingley's staff, he was there representing the BIF, even if unofficially. It behooved him to know something about the world he was about to visit. He focused on the screen, flipped through a chapter on Earth pre-Euchre contact, Bingley's unsubtle attempt to show that Euchre technology had improved human lives, then paused at a transcript of the first communique Earth had ever received from the diminutive, long-tailed Euchre race. "We offer the people of Earth 6 spaceships capable of faster-than-light speed. We offer the people of Earth training in creating and piloting such ships. We ask but one thing, that no euchre who sets down on your planet be harmed or detained. We will consider every offer coming from any political entity with a population of greater than 10 million. We will work with the first entity who most believably provides the assurance of safety that we require and who has the capacity to build the ships. We require the names of the human people who will work with our euchre people, information about the human people, information about the site where the ships will be built, and information about the site where pilots will be trained. We will accept the first round of bids that arrive within 1 week of the end of this broadcast. We will evaluate them based partially on how specific they are, partially on how believable they are, and partially on how well our instructions have been followed. Even with the years between him and secondary school, Darcy was familiar with the communication. Upon receipt of it, Queen Elizabeth had foregone all modern protocol by calling in the Prime Minister and several influential members of Parliament, and giving them her order to proceed. There was no actual record of what she'd said, but it was reported as, "A country that ruled the waves should not be intimidated by the stars." Rumour had it she'd also told them to ignore politics and get in a bid for Britain. All agreed she'd spoken for less than 2 minutes, but Darcy knew all that already, so he kept skimming. Darcy paused again, this time on the second euchre communiqué. "The enemy has repeatedly attacked us with biological and physical weapons. If you accept FTL technology, the enemy will most likely target you. Our euchre scientists say that human peoples will not be affected by the biological weapons the enemy uses against euchres, but we believe that if you accept FTL technology, the enemy will develop bioweapons that will affect you. If you refuse to accept this technology, it is unlikely you will be a target. However, we do not give you a species-wide vote. We will work with any nation or coalition of nations that can plausibly meet our conditions. What you do with your FTL technology is up to you. We hope you will join us in our fight against the enemy. We do not require your promise to do so." In other words, the euchres were betting that humans would take the offer of technology, attract the attention of the enemy, and be forced to fight back. A safe bet, but one which hadn't been tested immediately. There had been a few golden years when Earth possessed FTL technology without catching the enemy's notice. As a race, they'd made some wondrous advances during that time. The future had been bright. Although the ships couldn't reach faster than light speeds within the solar system, they were faster and safer than anything else. Earth had used them to put bases on the Moon, Mars, and several of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. The bases had been a planet-wide endeavor, and initially unifying, and hadn't seemed to garner enemy attention. Or so they'd thought, until the enemy attacked with human-based contagions, like Dreaderia. Oddly, even with all their technology, the enemy hadn't been anywhere near as successful in killing humans through biological warfare as they were in killing euchres that way. After a fashion, the euchres had been correct about that. Thoughts of the enemy made Darcy itch to be on the flight deck, and brought a grimace. A lot of people hated euchres because of the enemy, and hated the British Empire as well. In giving the British FTL technology, the euchres had brought humans into the ongoing war with the enemy. There was no argument about that. There was also no denying that the British government had been the first to submit a satisfactory plan for keeping euchres safe on Earth. They'd won the bid to welcome the aliens and learn from them. Young as he'd been, Darcy still recalled the debates. politicians and pundits raging on every channel, be it newspapers, radio, or television. The protests, the votes in Parliament. None of it had mattered. In the end, the lure of technology had been too great for humankind to resist. He also recalled the anger, though no recollection was required because the sentiment continued to this day. Darcy understood the animosity directed at Euchres, but couldn't agree with it. After all, the Euchres had warned Earth. They'd made no secret about the existence of the enemy, or that they wanted Earth fighters in their ongoing war. As to those who blamed his country for bringing the enemy's attention to Earth, if Britain hadn't taken what the Euchres offered, surely Russia, the United States, India, China, or any number of other nations or coalitions of nations would have. How his nation had won out, Darcy didn't know, as the Euchres had said little about their various rejections. Everyone knew that, in the case of the United States, however, their Congress had failed to agree on where to put the factory to build the ships, the creation of their bid ending in acrimonious debate over who was to blame, which suited Darcy, as he deemed it for the best that his country won, not only for them, but the world. Britain hadn't hoarded the technology as other nations might have. They'd given themselves a jump on it, certainly, but they'd always promised to share FTL travel with the rest of the world, and had done so. Not all the other great nations of Earth would have, or the not-so-great nations. 5 different dictatorships had put in bids almost simultaneously with Great Britain. Darcy shuddered to think what they would have done with the ships that could bomb anywhere on Earth, without danger of being shot down. He shook his head to dispel his musings, and refocused on Bingley's report. The next bit seemed more promising of Euchre insights. The transcripts of the opening lecture given to a class of human engineers by their first Euchre professor.
There are 3 problems with using FTL, that is, faster-than-light technology, which we will teach you how to solve. The first problem is getting ships up to FTL speed. The second problem is making ships safe from any incidental space debris that they will inevitably encounter. The third problem is keeping inertia from killing those on board.
Darcy rather felt the third problem to be the most salient, but he supposed it didn't mean much without solving the first 2. But this again was familiar material. This was Earth history, really, not information about Euchres. It told him nothing about their planet or their society. Again, he wished Bingley had been a little less comprehensive. This was supposed to be a briefing, not a textbook. Darcy started scrolling again. He would much rather read about the bubbles, as they were called, which seemed like political units. They had separate governments, like members of the Commonwealth, although there was a planet-wide government over them. They had something to do with the containment of diseases that were an issue created by the enemy, but Darcy thought keeping groups of thousands, or even millions, of beings isolated from each other would be impractical. If he could find where Bingley's history of human-Euchre interaction ended, and actual Euchre information began, maybe Darcy could learn the full how and why of the so-called bubbles on Takatara. His scrolling revealed human history going on and on, though he was only 3% through the document. He yawned. Maybe a few hours of sleep would be better than reading this report.
"Darcy!"
screeched Hurst's voice over the intercom. The tone, not the word, made Darcy jump up and dash from his quarters. Hurst was a laid-back pilot, competent enough not to be easily rattled. Darcy ran from his room and started up the ladder to the flight deck. The ship jerked. Darcy struggled to keep hold of the ladder, feet flying free of the rungs. He gritted his teeth and pulled, clambering the rest of the way up to the deck. They jerked again as he dashed across the small open space between ladder and controls. He used the momentum to stumble up against the vacant co-pilot's chair. He dropped into the seat to buckle in, ordering, "Report!" I... Hurst stuttered. "What happened?" Darcy said in a firm but calm tone, his gaze taking in the ship's displays superimposed over the view of space on the large screen before him, red warning lights pulsing. Hurst gulped audibly. "Two ships! The enemy!" By the time Hurst got that out, Darcy had already taken in the enemy trajectories on the screen. Swiftly, he tapped in his captain's code and took control of the ship. "Should we fight?" Hurst asked as Darcy started an evasive maneuver. "We have neither the firepower nor the armor." "Shouldn't we be turning?" Hurst continued over Darcy, his voice high. "They know which direction we're going. All they have to do is follow us." "They already knocked out 2 inertia cancelers," Darcy said. "If we turn too sharply, it'll kill us." That's what had happened to the crew on the ship in the Allenham system, the one he'd loaned a pilot. Focused on the readouts before him, Darcy enacted a series of minute turns which would be impossible to predict, and which put him thousands of kilometers from the projected course of their initial escape path. Even undamaged, the enemy vessels wouldn't be able to turn quickly enough to stay with them. A fresh scan found no sign of the enemy ships that had crossed their path. Relief washed through him. He put them on a course that would meet Takatara several days later than they were expected, the best he dared do under the circumstances, especially until he got a look at the detailed maintenance report. Even without looking, he knew they couldn't risk a high speed, assuming they were still capable of reaching it. Not with 2 inertia cancelers down. Nor was the route he'd selected the fastest way to the planet, even at the slower speed, because Hurst was right about the likelihood that the enemy would guess their destination. They would undoubtedly scour the optimal course. Some of the tension leaving his shoulders, Darcy double-checked their heading and re-scanned for enemy vessels, but still didn't find any. "Reverting flight controls to you," he said to Hurst. "Got them," Hurst confirmed, resolutely focusing on piloting. Satisfied, Darcy unbuckled and stood to stretch cramped muscles, and realized he was barefoot. This was hardly his first time on a damaged ship, and he could tell by the feel of the deck under his feet. The way the usual subsonic rumble of the engine seemed a fraction of a decibel off, that they hadn't come out of the attack unscathed. More was wrong with the Netherfield than the loss of 2 inertia cancelers. Darcy sat back down and took a more detailed look at the damage reports, only to find that the initial rapid scan reported the damage to the hull as oddly mild. The enemy must have been surprised to come across them, as they'd been by the enemy. The enemy's attacks were often not only unpredictable but also illogical. The enemy seemed to have the ability to attack any target, but they didn't pick the ones that would do the most damage. Darcy was grateful for the odd combination of a species with sophisticated enough science to build biological weapons, but a lack of understanding about the best military targets. Ignoring Hurst's still laboured breathing, Darcy brought up the log on the small co-pilot's screen before him to review Hurst's reaction. As captain, he had the duty of assessing Hurst's performance to make any required decisions about his suitability to continue to pilot at this time. From the pilot seat, Hurst stole a quick glance at Darcy's screen before facing forward again, where the preliminary damage report still stood out in white letters on the main screen, set against the backdrop of stars that was the view of the direction the ship was going. Hurst cleared his throat and said, "I'd never been so happy to see you, Captain." After a pause, he somewhat sheepishly added, "I panicked." Darcy looked up from the recording of Hurst's behavior, open alongside the external sensory array log. 8 seconds after you knew about the enemy, you called for help from someone with battlefield experience. Do you have battlefield experience? I've only been in one battle, as a trainee. I didn't do anything, Hurst admitted, voicing what Darcy already knew before dropping his gaze. Today you did something. You took evasive action, which was appropriate. Not as much evasive action as I should have, Hurst said. I was afraid I'd throw everyone but me against a wall. In the first place, it worked. We escaped alive, and should make it to Takatara. In the second, if everyone took the same kind of evasive action, we would become too predictable. A clatter sounded from below. Darcy swiveled to look over his shoulder as Louisa climbed up onto the flight deck. Wordlessly, she took the third chair used for flight planning and running maintenance checks, which was what he wanted done right now. He caught her eye and nodded in approval, noting hair damp with sweat and a series of red marks which would probably turn into bruises on her arm. She appeared to have full mobility, but he would remind her to check her status later. If necessary, he would insist she use the diagnostic wand from the medical kit. Injuries in battle should be logged. Darcy frowned, wondering why Perry hadn't used the wand to diagnose his appendicitis. Then again, that often came on suddenly. Aloud, he said to Louisa, "After you initiate a full maintenance check, locate Ambassador Bingley and find out his status." As an afterthought, he added, "Do the same for Caroline." Louisa nodded. Features pinched with worry, she strapped in, hopefully unnecessarily. Hands shaking ever so slightly, she activated voice commands and started murmuring to the computer. Darcy didn't mind her fear. He respected her healthy sense of self-preservation. Only an idiot wouldn't be afraid while under attack by the enemy. "Do you want the helm, Captain?" Hurst asked, still sounding contrite. "You keep it. I'm still assessing what happened." Darcy had found no fault with Hurst's skill so far, but his instincts said something had gone wrong. It wasn't simply the attack that had put Hurst in a panic. On the co-pilot's personal monitor, Darcy scrolled back both flight deck replay and sensory data, trusting Hurst to watch for any new dangers. Darcy paused his scrolling. 40 seconds before Hurst had called Darcy, the computer had flagged a meteoroid that was approaching them. Hurst either hadn't noted the computer's warning or had ignored it, thinking he knew better. Darcy couldn't decide which was worse. It wasn't until the meteoroid changed course and split into 2 shapes, causing the computer to ping a second warning, that Hurst had looked at the message, panicked, and called for Darcy. Nearly 8 more seconds had passed before Hurst made his evasive maneuver. "Charles is uninjured, Captain," Louisa said, sounding relieved. "So is Caroline. The maintenance report is nearly ready. I'll start going over it." "Let me know what you find." Darcy closed the windows on the co-pilot's personal screen. A quick glance at the external sensor array feed showed nothing amiss, so he stood once more. No matter how reassuring the initial damage report appeared, the hum beneath his bare feet still felt off. "I'll be in my cabin." Darcy crossed the flight deck to the ladder, certain something was wrong, and worried the enemy would find them again before repairs could be made. Chapter 5. Course Change. Back in his quarters, Darcy stretched out on the bed again and began reviewing the recent activity of his new travelling companions. In his capacity as captain, He'd already gone over their certifications, training, and records. He had not, however, taken the time to review their more recent performances. Most specifically, he wanted to study the recordings of their piloting, easily enough done with their patches linked to the ship. He also wanted to delve further into Perry's appendicitis. Something about that didn't sit right, even if it had been sudden and acute. Louisa's performance to date was spotless, as were her previous records. Accessing the ship's recording of their last journey, the one halted on Brighton 4, Darcy watched the projection his patch provided of Louisa submitting a call for the Netherfield's captain. Louisa had sighted a dubious meteoroid, quite similar to the one overlooked by Hurst today, and immediately informed Perry. That meteoroid had turned out to be harmless, but looking at the recording, she'd done the right thing. Stephen Hurst's recordings had several incidents, but no flags. Recordings of his piloting, which Darcy watched significantly sped up, showed a conscientious pilot. His attention rarely wandered from the screen, though how much focus he gave the sensory readouts was unclear. His reactions, while within acceptable parameters, were on the slow side. Not optimal for someone piloting a ship hurtling through space at speeds faster than light could travel, even if he did have a computer to back him up. Certainly, Darcy would not give Hurst a passing grade for his recent performance, nor, however, would he add an official black mark to his records. Next, he delved into the logs of Perry's ailment. The first entry on the subject said that Perry had realized he wasn't well and alerted Hurst, as his second. That had been about the time they were approaching the double star system that had Brighton 4 orbiting one star and Takatara orbiting the other. While Hurst took the helm, Louisa had sought the ship's diagnostics wand to identify the problem. She couldn't find it. In fact, the entire medical kit was missing. The log showed that Perry then informed the others that he had searched for the kit the day before, but couldn't find it. Hoping he would be well after a night's sleep, he'd gone to bed. Unfortunately, rather than improving, his pain had grown worse. Next, Louisa had checked the Netherfield's logs to ensure that the medical kit was logged as on board, which it was, but no one could locate it. She'd gone to Bingley then, and he had made an immediate decision to change course to Brighton 4 since it was closer than Takatara. His logged reason for the decision was partially based on not having the medical kit. Fortunately, they had already started their deceleration, making it possible to reach Brighton 4 in time. A medical crew met them, and Perry was taken to a human doctor. He was saved, but it had been a very close call. Darcy shook his head, disgusted by someone's level of incompetence. Caroline's? Didn't ensuring the ship was properly stocked fall into her province as manager of the ambassadorial household? Had it really not been on board, or simply misplaced? Important items, like the medical kit, should be where they were logged as being. Reluctantly, as even watching a recording of her for official captaincy reasons left a sour taste in his mouth, Darcy opened Caroline Bingley's flight logs. Not fully certified for off-planet flight, her role before his arrival had been to briefly spell people as pilot, monitoring their course and the sensory feed for stints of no more than 15 minutes. Even after 10, her eyes weren't always on the screen. On several occasions, she'd brought up personal correspondence on her patch. Once, she'd spent the time painting her nails. After the first week of travel, Perry had decreased her shifts to 10 minutes. He decreased them again to 7. One of the things Caroline needed to move up to a higher level of certification was to log another 50 hours. It should have been easy on a 1-month trip, but she was nowhere near that level. Darcy was pleased he'd never permitted her at the helm while he was captain, and closed the log. It never ceased to amaze him how people acted, even though they knew both what they should be doing, and that their patch's interface with the ship recorded everything. He folded his hands behind his head. Patches had changed things, and yet they also hadn't. Darcy still remembered the first time he'd seen one, and his awe that he could pass his hand through the solid-looking image the patch projected. His cousins, Richard and Mary, had come for tea a few days before their first FTL flight. Darcy had been a kid then, and Richard was his hero. He'd looked like an action figure in his new FTL pilot's uniform, and Mary had been very official in her role as one of the first female human FTL engineers. They'd both shown off how their Euchre patches worked. Darcy would never forget the sight of Richard projecting an image of himself flying a virtual test flight into the air before him, while Mary and Darcy's parents carried on an animated conversation about politics.
"How do they do that?"
Darcy had asked his cousin, awed. Richard had answered with a chuckle and a shrug. "I don't rightly know, and I don't care. All that matters to me is that the Euchre ships are designed to interact with them, so I need one. All the pilots have them, the engineers too."
"But how does it show stuff in the air in front of you, right through your uniform?"
Richard shook his head. "If I knew, I'd say. Not my side of technology, though, I'm afraid. They stuck it in me, and it works."
"In you?"
Darcy recalled asking, both intrigued and horrified.
"Did it hurt?"
Richard rubbed at his left shoulder, just under the collarbone. "Some, especially as it goes in right here, and I've always had a bit of trouble with this shoulder since I broke it when I was about your age." Darcy had nodded. He'd seen the scars from all the surgeries his cousin had endured to fix a shoulder smashed when he was thrown from a horse during a hunt.
"And it watches everything you do?"
"Yes, but it doesn't have much storage space of its own. They're quite small. That's why they interface with larger computers like the ship. You'll see when you become a pilot and get one." Darcy recalled his grin, his anticipation of being an FTL pilot like Richard, with a uniform and a patch. He smiled at the memory even now, the expression bittersweet. That was the last time he'd seen his favorite cousin. Now almost everyone in developed countries had patches, and most things on Earth were set up to interface with them. They took calls, received and left messages, paid for things, and let you into your vehicle and your home. Everything. Darcy didn't know what he'd do without his. But he did know what he would do with it. With a sigh, he brought back up Bingley's report, and returned to where he'd been before Hurst's call of distress. He was asleep in moments. Darcy definitely caught up on his sleep over the course of their journey to Takatara. What he didn't manage to catch up on was Bingley's briefing. He tried whenever he was off duty, even going so far as to read while he ate, in an attempt to stay awake. But Bingley's excruciatingly detailed account of all things Euchre was better than Scotch for putting Darcy into an immediate stupor. He hardly even made it through sections he found interesting, like the bit on the bubbles, a section which started with an endless and barely related history lesson, as each section seemed to. It wasn't his turn at the helm when it came time for their final approach to Takatara, but Darcy made his way to the flight deck regardless. There was something magical about the first sight of a new-to-him world, a whole planet spinning slowly in space, that called to him like a siren seeking to wreak havoc on sailors. Wearing shoes this time, he climbed up the ladder to the deck. With a brief greeting to Louisa, who replied in kind but didn't turn from the display before her, Darcy strapped into the co-pilot seat. In the large front display, the marble-like gleam that was Takatara steadily grew and grew more. Darcy studied the planet rapidly filling the horizon. It felt like Earth, with so much ocean, green on most of the land he saw, and scattered clouds. Fortunately, it was Louisa's turn to be monitoring their course and the sensory array, freeing Darcy to stare at the brilliant beauty before them and ponder the strange twisting in his gut. Approaching the planet where Richard had died, the last known location of both him and Mary, oddly unsettled Darcy. He hadn't expected that.
"We received a message from the surface," Louisa said. "They request our current status."
Darcy had already sent them details about the encounter with the enemy and a preliminary report on the damage to the Netherfield. "Send them the maintenance report as well as the entire log of the trip. Ambassador Bingley has nothing to hide. This is a diplomatic mission to a planet on the same side as we are." As captain, Darcy would have made that decision regardless of which friendly world they approached, and felt it appropriate to do so now, even though Earth didn't have formal relations with Takatara. Yet, that's what Bingley's mission was about, and Bingley rarely failed. "Right," Louisa said, then switched to addressing the computer to give the order. "You're aware that the sensors needed for an automatic landing are damaged?" Darcy asked her.
"I am, Captain."
"We'll have to take her in manually. Would you like to land her?" Before Darcy finished his question, Hurst came up the ladder to the flight deck. Louisa still kept her attention on the screen, but grinned as she said, "Yes, sir." Darcy hid a smile of his own. Her enthusiasm pleased him. People who enjoyed what they did were generally better at it. On Darcy's other side, Hurst strapped into the communications chair. Darcy didn't have to look to feel the other man's silent pique. As co-pilot, Hurst may have hoped to be asked to land them. Darcy would take over before he trusted a limping ship to an only adequate pilot. "We're getting another message from the surface," Hurst said. He held up a hand for silence, his gaze on the scrolling screen, then dropped his arm. "They want us to alter course. The damage is too extensive for the average repair bay. We're being asked to land in Hartford." Wasn't that the location of the Meryton Mechanics and Pilot University? At the university? Hurst shook his head. "No, someplace called Longbourn Crater." He glanced over. "It's a repair bay." Longbourn Crater. Darcy frowned. Wouldn't the university have the best, most up-to-date mechanics on hand? Why not land there, rather than this Longbourn place? What could possibly be in Longbourn that was worth their while? "Did they send the coordinates?" Darcy asked. He didn't like this. The special ambassador to Takatara should receive a formal greeting at the capital, or at least at the Alliance's paramount FTL pilot and engineering academy. Ambassador Bingley wouldn't receive the reception he deserved at a repair bay. Hurst nodded. "They sent them. It's outside the city, on the eastern end of the largest island." Louisa glanced at Darcy.
"Should I change course, Captain?"
Hurst snorted. "We'd better if they can't fix her anywhere else. I'd like to get home someday." "Accept the course change," Darcy ordered Louisa, hoping he wasn't making a mistake. Chapter 6. Landing. Darcy kept half his attention on Louisa as she entered the course change, then turned back to the view. A moment later, steps sounded on the ladder leading to the flight deck.
"The computer said we've made a course change?"
Bingley asked cheerfully as his head emerged up the ladder. "Ambassador," Darcy greeted. "Yes, we've been asked to set down at a repair bay in Longbourn Crater." Bingley pursed his lips, his left eye twitching in a way that meant he consulted the AI implant there, currently tied into the ship's main computer. It was a personal upgrade, built by the Northanger race, which interfaced with the patch and sent information directly to the brain. The implant was considered experimental for humans, but Darcy knew Bingley was happy with it. After a moment, Bingley nodded. "Right. Longbourn Crater. Outside Meryton, but still inside Hartford Bubble. Perfectly acceptable." Bingley's words brought one of the few facts about the Euchre homeworld that Darcy had managed to read up on to the surface of his mind: the bubbles. Once he'd found the correct section of Bingley's report, in between the naps that reading it induced, Darcy had learned that you couldn't travel between the bubbles without spending between 1 and 3 years in a quarantine zone. That meant Bingley would not receive the reception he deserved, and he might not be able to complete the mission he'd embarked on. Behind Bingley, Caroline climbed free of the ladder.
"What's this I hear about a course change? We won't be staying in the capital?" she asked, her voice high with a typical note of complaint. "You are Earth's ambassador to Tokatara. You should be in the capital."
Bingley waved a dismissive hand. "As I concluded in section 836 of my report, we'll actually get more out of being in Hertford Bubble, because the university's there. It's the most intergalactic bubble, the most forward-thinking and accessible." He shrugged. "Besides, they have excellent telecommunications on Takatara. Any bubble will do."
"But Charles,"
Caroline continued in a voice grown only more aggrieved,
"what about the receptions, the shopping, the theatre, the interviews?"
She threw up her hands.
"What's the point of being here at all if we're stuck in some backwater, away from everything worthwhile?"
She turned to Darcy, lashes batting.
"Don't you agree, Captain Darcy?"
Was she wearing false eyelashes? Darcy did not consider cosmetics a good use of weight allowance, but supposed how she spent hers was up to her. He also had to concede that false eyelashes weren't heavy. The point in being here is a successful completion of our diplomatic mission, which technology on Tokatara will permit us to do from Hertford," Bingley said firmly, "and I certainly don't want to start by antagonizing our hosts."
"But shouldn't we start by showing who's in charge?"
Caroline asked. "Everyone knows that," Bingley said. "They are." "Besides which," Hurst chimed in, "if we don't land her at this Longbourn place, we'll never take off again. I suspect you won't enjoy Takatara enough to want to live here, Carol."
"Don't call me that,"
she snapped, jabbing a finger angrily into his shoulder, then crying, "Oh, no." Louisa stole a quick glance away from the screen.
"What?" "My nail came off. We had to pack so light. I only brought a few sets."
False nails, too. Darcy kept his expression bland, and returned his gaze to the scattered islands filling the screen before them, which Caroline didn't seem to have noticed. He hoped Bingley was even now recalling an argument they'd had over nepotism a few years ago. If not, Darcy might have to revisit the subject. Regardless of where his thoughts might be, Ambassador Bingley crossed the deck to stand beside Darcy, where he sat in the co-pilot's chair. "Beautiful planet. I've seen thousands of images, of course, but Takatara is exceptional to behold." Darcy nodded his agreement. Views like this were what made being an intergalactic pilot the only career Darcy had ever considered. Not fighting the enemy, though he did so with enthusiasm for keeping Earth safe. Not wearing the uniform and attending functions as some graduates loved to do, though Darcy donned his captain's coat with pride. The real draw, the heart of all the work Darcy had done to be where he was space itself, travel to distant worlds. Yes, he'd visited his Aunt Catherine a few times in the Kent system, but that was just one world and its moons. Before Brighton 4, Darcy had never met any Euchres in person, and had encountered only one Northanger, and, of course, plenty of Kentians. He even had an adopted cousin who was Kentian. He liked his Kentian cousin Anne better than any of his human cousins, now that Richard was dead, and Mary was who knew where. But he'd never even seen a Kellenshire in person, let alone any of the more obscure allied races, like Combs. Part of that was his own fault, in a way. With his piloting and command skills, the higher-ups at the British Intergalactic Force mostly kept him near Earth, defending her. He had applied for and been granted that brief tour to the Allenham system, and had studied their culture with all the available material Earth had, but he'd been too busy fighting the enemy to spend time with the Allenhamites. In the chair beside his, Louisa drew in a long, slow breath. "All right, I'm taking her down in 60. "Buckle in, Ambassador. Caroline," Darcy ordered. Hurst grinned. "It's going to be tricky with a damaged ship and the crater walls." A glance showed Hurst's expression proud, presumably of Louisa's skill as a pilot, refuting Darcy's earlier interpretation of pique. Behind the 3 command chairs, Bingley and Caroline moved to opposite walls to pull down jump seats, where they could buckle in. "Louisa can handle a damaged ship and crater walls," Darcy said, keeping half his attention on Bingley and Caroline.
"I can't see as well from here,"
Caroline grumbled, starting to stand back up. "I said buckle in," Darcy reiterated. "Protocol dictates that all crew members be buckled in during takeoff and landing."
"But Louisa is flying,"
Caroline protested. "Show me where it says in the regulations that buckling in doesn't apply when Louisa Hurst is flying, and you can stand up." "Captain Darcy, always by the book," Hurst said with a laugh. Louisa tapped the screen before her, turning off the automated controls so she could land. A line of concentration creased her brow as her attention fixed on the readouts before her. But Darcy didn't see only concentration on her face. He also saw joy. She liked the challenge. Takatara spread out below them, even bluer than Earth. Water covered over 3/4 of the surface, which gleamed the deep cobalt of a freshwater lake, white clouds emphasizing the color. And the water was fresh, there being little sodium on the planet. Earlier, they'd passed over a continent perhaps a little larger than Australia, but green through and through, rather than filled with desert. The smaller land masses were often crater-shaped, speaking to the planet's volatile past, and came in innumerable sizes, from being able to hold cities and farmland to too small to have any houses.
"It's beautiful,"
Louisa murmured as she took them lower, the vast expanse of water growing to fill more and more of the view. Reflected in ghost-like transparency on the main screen, Darcy could see that behind him Bingley leaned forward in his seat, twisting to stare at the planet. Caroline sat with her arms crossed and a mulish look on her face, not bothering to look even though Takatara now filled the screen nearest her. Louisa maneuvered them in the direction of the largest island in the cluster that dotted the water before them, like splattered paint. Several volcanic craters jutted up from the ocean and lowlands. Soon, the largest, verdantly green and patterned terraced fields came to dominate the view.
"We're headed into that,"
Caroline groused.
"There's hardly anything there."
A check of her faint reflection showed she'd given up pouting and turned to study the view.
"Where's the university?"
Bingley asked. From higher up, Darcy had seen a town on the other side of the volcanic crater, but this side was steep with little sign of civilization. He supposed things could be worse. There were much more obscure bubbles on which they could have been forced to land, rather than simply on the less inhabited side of the Hertford one. Besides which, more than any theatre or shopping, Darcy had wanted to visit the Meriton Mechanics and Pilot University, and he suspected Bingley did as well. Louisa eased the Netherfield left, with the landing site clearly visible inside the large crater. Darcy was impressed that she not only was able to control the direction, she kept their deceleration at a level that allowed their remaining inertia canceller to keep them at 1 g, giving them the comfortable feeling of Earth gravity. Trusting her, Darcy continued to study the view. Takatara's beauty struck with a certain amount of awe. He loved Earth, but he'd grown accustomed to seeing her from space and the upper reaches of the atmosphere. Allenham had been interesting, but the native vegetation was a dull brown which, from a distance, was difficult to tell from deserts, leaving the whole planet looking bare. Brighton 4 boasted green flora, but the terraforming was complete in only a few low-altitude areas, leaving bare rocks or soil covering much of the surface, since oxygen content anywhere high up was low, despite the massive projects to increase it. Takatara had a feel of natural wonder. Splashes of lush life in a sparkling expanse of blue sea dotted with white clouds. The Yucca's relatively small population, coupled with technological advancements, made that possible. Of course, the price of that low population had been extreme, taking the form of multiple pandemics started by the enemy. Hence the Yucca's need for bubbles.
"That's this Longbourn place?"
Caroline asked, tone edged in derision, as they dropped closer to a settlement with a scant scattering of buildings.
"You have got to be kidding me."
Darcy had to agree. It looked like a ship landing pad and scrapyard built inside a cornfield. Only the crop wasn't corn, but something with which he was unfamiliar.
"I'm certain they know what they are doing,"
Bingley said with the easy confidence that made him such a good ambassador.
"Setting her down in 3, 2, 1.
Louisa counted. The Netherfield landed with only a slight jar, tilting somewhat as one of the landing arms had been damaged in the attack. Louisa dropped her hands from the controls and turned to Darcy with a grin. "Well done," he said, because part of being a captain was giving credit where credit was due, and Louisa's flying had been professional and above grade. The sound of belts snapping open, Darcy's included, filled the flight deck.
"Very well,"
Bingley said cheerfully, coming to his feet.
"Let's go see what we're dealing with here." "I'll get your coat, Charles,"
Caroline said as he strode to the ladder. As aggravating as Caroline could be, in her capacity to ensure that the ambassador maintained his dignity, she could definitely be counted on.
"You should wear yours as well, Louisa, Stephen."
She flashed white teeth at Darcy.
"You already look impeccable, Captain."
"Wait," Darcy said. "Bingley and I will go out first, alone, at least until we've assessed our reception." Bingley chuckled.
"We're on a friendly planet, Darcy."
"And have landed where neither we nor they expected us to land. Standard procedure." Darcy was aware that Hurst mouthed "standard procedure" along with him. Bingley shrugged.
"You're the captain."
Caroline pursed her lips but nodded.
"I'll still get your coat, Charles."
She swung onto the ladder, her ability to climb down in heels impressive even while being ridiculous to Darcy. He turned back to the screen. Despite his care to follow procedure, eagerness stirred in him. He looked forward to seeing what life was like on Takatara. The Yuccas he'd met on Brighton 4 had been easy to work with, helpful, friendly, and unassuming. He also knew Yuccas to be an intelligent and innovative race. Even after the initial hiccup of being redirected to this Longbourn Crater place, Darcy had high hopes for a visit lacking in conflict or aggravation. Chapter 7. Meeting the Natives. The first thing Darcy noted as they descended the short gangplank was how amazingly fresh the air smelled. It instantly invigorated, almost a drug in its purity. The second was the wash of sounds. Calls his earth-trained ears took to be bird songs and insect chirps, clattered and squawked, filling the world with a lively vibrancy that the interior of an interplanetary vessel sorely lacked. The third thing, as he pulled his attention from the nearly overwhelming swell of nature, was that they weren't being met by euchres. At least, not only by euchres. 2 of the grey-skinned, long-snouted, diminutive euchres did approach, but they were accompanied by 3 humans. Unexpected, as very few humans resided on Takatara at any one time, and he thought most would be at the university. The taller euchre did not reach Darcy's shoulders, and the smaller was waist-high, and both wore something akin to coveralls. The shortest human was female, and Darcy had the quick impression of dark hair shoved up under a hat, lively eyes, and a figure that even her mechanic's coveralls couldn't diminish. The taller woman also wore pants, but her clothing was office attire. The gentleman, in his 50s or 60s, was grey-haired with his years and dressed somewhere in between the 2 women. Not coveralls, but nothing as neat and professional-looking as the taller woman. Despite his slight dishevelment, he walked a bit ahead of the others. The 2 groups met on the landing pad, under the shadow of the slightly tilted Netherfield. The man turned to Bingley, who was now wearing his jacket, patch displaying his ambassadorship. "Ambassador Bingley, we were told to expect you," the man said, surprising Darcy again by speaking English. "I'm Bennet. These are my daughters, Jane and Elizabeth, and our colleagues, Charlotte and William of the Lucas clan, in the human tongue." Bennet. Darcy frowned. The name was familiar. A Bennet had helped Britain secure the first FTL ships on Earth and institute the first courses taught by euchres at Cambridge, and then helped those euchres leave Earth in the same spectacular display of treason that had claimed Richard's life. Verbal silence settled about them. Darcy cast Bingley a quick look, surprised he didn't speak. He took in Bingley's glazed expression and said, "I'm Captain Darcy, of the British Intergalactic Force. This is Ambassador Bingley, Earth's special envoy to Takatara." "You are welcome here, Captain Darcy. Ambassador, please assure your crew of such." A clatter sounded behind them, and Bingley's relations spilled out, having obviously been listening and just as obviously in no need of Bingley or Darcy's permission to disembark. Coming forward, Hurst extended his hand to Bennet. "Stephen Hurst, co-pilot, at your service." Bennet eyed the proffered hand, his expression bemused, then extended one that visibly trembled to clasp it. "No one's offered me a handshake in quite some time." "Because of the Dreaderia tremors?" Caroline asked in a high voice, even though Dreaderia wasn't contagious once it progressed to tremors, which it only did if left untreated. Of course, Bennet was old enough to have contracted the enemy-designed disease before treatments were available, and he was on a planet where they wouldn't be readily obtained even now. Dreaderia was engineered to attack humans. Bennet's eyebrows shot up, and he released Hurst's hand. "Because euchres don't shake hands." Bingley cast his sister a frown. "Euchres flare their neck spines in greeting, Caroline. You know that. It was in my briefing." She pinched her very red, glossed lips into an ugly circle and nodded. "Yes, of course." "Besides which, you're inoculated," Bingley added. They all were. Despite the low number of humans on Takatara, none were allowed to land on the planet without a recent inoculation against the highly contagious enemy disease. Turning to the 2 euchres, Bingley held his hands up his neck and flapped them in the euchre-approved human equivalent of their greeting, a gesture Darcy had seen Bingley practice in front of his reflection. The 2 euchres, Charlotte and William, stepped forward. Both opened the spiny flaps that lay against their long necks, then waved them in a motion that was more like the ripple on the surface of a pond than Bingley's flapping. Bingley grinned, clearly pleased. He turned to gesture to Louisa. "This is our communications and operations officer, my sister Louisa Hurst, and finally my adjunct, Caroline Bingley." "Your wife?" Jane Bennet asked softly.
My sister.
Caroline cleared her throat.
Yes, well, now that we've exchanged introductions, I believe there is work to be done. I will need information on setting up accommodations for the ambassador, as well as reliable planetary communication. The ambassador is meant to be in the planetary capital, not here.
Amusement that Darcy suspected was at their expense dancing in her eyes, Elizabeth Bennet stepped forward.
Jane can assist you quite well with that, Caroline.
Jane nodded, smiling at Bingley. Elizabeth then gestured to the Netherfield.
Your ship's damage report was forwarded to us. You have damage to 2 inertia cancellers, your sensory array, your landing gear, and to the hull, as well as a few minor issues. She was damaged in a skirmish with the enemy?
Yes, Hurst said. They came at us when we were a day out from Takatara. We ran. Well, retreated sounds better. He dove into a detailed account, somewhat exaggerated, and which left out his failings. While Hurst recounted the story, the highlights of which had already been forwarded to this location, Darcy studied the array of patches before him. The patches of both Euchres, as well as those of both Bennet daughters, displayed accreditations with which Darcy was not familiar, but Bennet's showed him to be a master mechanic, Cambridge trained. His patch also showed that his master mechanic's accreditations were up to date, so he'd been tested and passed within the last 3 years. Yet he was not in one of the large bubbles with a bustling city, where a man of his skills could expect to make a solid living, but merely a smallish one. Did Bennet live in Hertford Bubble because of his dread area, which would render his skills useless? If so, why did he bother with accreditation, which would be expensive here? Bennet, Darcy mused. Cambridge trained, but living in a bubble on Takatara. The notorious Thomas Bennet of the Uke desertion. It must be. He was the right age. There were too few humans on Takatara for it to be anyone else. Quite possibly the last human to see Richard alive. Bennet might also know if Mary still resided on Takatara. Darcy had never understood the Fitzwilliams' failure to maintain contact with her, especially with all the resources at his Uncle Matlock's disposal.
So, you weren't in the cockpit when you were attacked, Captain Darcy? Elizabeth asked.
Darcy realized Hurst had finished his recounting, as he hadn't been paying attention. Darcy could only reply by shaking his head and issuing a curt no.
It wouldn't have mattered who was flying, Louisa said with sudden stiffness. No, certainly not, Elizabeth Bennet replied. I simply wish to ascertain if I need to interview both pilots about the way the ship handled in the immediate aftermath, or only one.
You? Darcy frowned, trying to press back the grimness that thoughts of Richard and Mary brought. Now was not the place or time for such speculation, not when repairs to the Netherfield were the topic of discussion. He could pin down Bennet's identity and ask about his cousins later. Elizabeth nodded, those eyes bright with amusement again.
Yes, me. I find it helps above and beyond what the computer can offer, to know how the pilot feels a ship performed.
Darcy recalled his interpretation of sluggishness in the Netherfield, while he enacted evasive maneuvers, and the incongruity in the hum beneath his bare feet when he stood to stretch.
Elizabeth's very good at repairing ships,
Jane Bennet put in. Darcy dropped his gaze to Elizabeth's patch again. Even if he didn't recognize the accreditation symbols displayed, he could see they certainly weren't Cambridge. He wasn't there to pander to the daughter of a traitor. I am not interested in having my ship repaired by an unqualified person who got her position through nepotism. Elizabeth's eyebrows shot up.
Through nepotism?
Her gaze slid to take in Caroline. Darcy ground his teeth together. Let Elizabeth Bennet think what she would, any malice from her was likely born of chagrin. With a face that pretty, she was surely accustomed to men not making a fuss about working with her, no matter her qualifications. But Darcy wasn't most men. He put substance over beauty. He turned to Bennet. "What about you?" Bennet held out a hand which continued to tremble. "As Caroline already noted, I have dread tremors," he said lightly. "I can't work on anything without Dravatol. But given your strong opinions about nepotism, perhaps Charlotte or William can do the job." He winked at Elizabeth, then added, gesturing to the two Euchres, "I am not related to Charlotte or William." The two Euchres chortled at that. Their tails, which had been resting on their left shoulders, waggled about their heads as they gave the Euchre's chirping laugh. Darcy felt heat scorch up his neck, but refused to give any other acknowledgment that Bennet's blow had landed. Bingley turned to the Euchres, looking surprised, then spoke to them in their own language. At university, Bingley had studied languages and cultures as diligently as Darcy had piloting. The man was a born diplomat.
"Yes, we do have Delaford translators linked to our patches,"
the shorter of the two, darker and with more stripes than the other, replied in English.
"I appreciate your addressing us in Takatari, but I dislike leaving the others out of communication."
At least the Euchres had manners, Darcy thought, and they had Delaford translators, which was surprising, as they were expensive and very new. Darcy's crew had been given access to one when they'd worked with the Euchre team on Brighton 4 to assess the damage to the Derbyshire. But the translator had come with a smallish Northanger who supervised their use of it, and packed it away at the end of each session with loving care. Turning from the Bennets, Darcy asked the two Euchres, "You've seen the damage report?" They nodded, a human gesture, while also dipping their tails in the Euchre equivalent.
"We have,"
the shorter said. Darcy gestured to the short one's patch. "I am not familiar with Euchre accreditations. Do you have the skills required?" Both Euchres switched the display on their patches to the Cambridge-accredited skill sets, as translated from their Euchre educations. Neither had Bennet's mastery, but based on Darcy's scan of the damage report, either one should suffice. He glanced at Louisa, who'd read the report in more detail, and she nodded to the bigger of the two Euchres. Darcy pointed at that one, who'd yet to speak, realizing he should have paid more attention to which Euchre was Charlotte, and which was William. Undoubtedly Bingley already knew, along with a whole host of other things that had been conveyed either consciously or unconsciously by Euchres and humans alike. But Darcy wasn't that adept when it came to sapient beings. "You are—" "William," Bingley supplied. "William," Darcy repeated gratefully. "You can repair her?" William dipped his tail, which Darcy assumed was acknowledgment, and asked,
"Is anyone else on board?"
"No," Bingley replied.
"Then I'll bring the ship into the hangar. We sometimes have bad weather."
William pulled up a screen with his patch.
"Your pilot did an excellent job of landing exactly where told. That makes it easy."
Apparently, at William's command, 6 pillars rose from the ground around the Netherfield. They sent out supports to cushion the ship. The landing spot moved slowly in the direction of a large hangar. Darcy was impressed not only by the efficiency of the systems, but by how accurately Louisa had hit the landing location. He estimated she was less than a meter from where she'd been told to land. As everyone watched the ship slowly move away, Bennet said, "No matter what the damage, it won't be fixed instantaneously."
"I will take you all somewhere to eat,"
Jane Bennet said in a raised voice before lowering it to continue,
"and we may discuss your needs, Ambassador, perhaps over a meal."
"Yes," Caroline said brightly.
"We'd enjoy that, wouldn't we?"
She shot quick looks at Louisa and Hurst. Not appearing to notice his sister, Bingley stepped forward, going to Jane. "That would be very kind of you. Is it Miss Bennet?" She laughed, a clear, cheery sound.
"It is, but really, Ambassador, you may call me Jane. Miss is not used on Takatara."
"That would be delightful, Jane." Bingley held out his hand, but when Jane clasped it to shake, he instead caught up her fingers and bowed over them. "And you must call me Charles." Darcy disapproved of Bingley's lack of subtlety, but Jane Bennet appeared delighted, and Darcy could understand Bingley's impulse to flirt with her. She had wavy blonde hair, swept back to hang free down to her shoulders, and a stunning smile. There was no doubt how attractive the woman was with her neat pants and matching blazer over a light blouse. Had she had time to change, or was this her normal attire? Caroline hurried forward to stand with them.
"And we need to assess the best option for communication with the capital. Don't forget about that, Charles."
"Oh, yes," Bingley said. "The capital." Over Bingley's shoulder, Darcy watched the mobile platform maneuver the Netherfield into the hangar.
"Right this way, Ambassador. Everyone,"
Jane Bennet said with a gesture. Bingley offered an arm. Jane didn't take it, but Darcy suspected that was less of a rejection than a misunderstanding. Bingley didn't appear bothered as he started forward, Caroline on one side and Louisa and Hurst following. With another wink at Elizabeth, Bennet turned to the trail after the group.
"And I suppose you and I should leave Captain Darcy to his work, Charlotte,"
Elizabeth said to the smaller Yucca. Charlotte chattered something in Takatari, despite her earlier words about not excluding humans from the conversation. Elizabeth laughed, glancing in the direction the others had gone.
"Well, if you like, but I don't know if you'll be getting a good representation of human behavior or not."
The Yucca, Charlotte, bobbed her tail, then rushed off after Bingley and the others. Expression a mystery, except for her obvious level of amusement at the entire encounter, Elizabeth then turned away without so much as a parting nod to Darcy. She walked briskly in the direction of the two largest ship hangars that edged the landing zone, and entered the one beside the one into which the Netherfield had disappeared. She didn't look back even once. Darcy stood there, alone, and ground his teeth. As beautiful as Takatara was from space, and as verdant and interesting the flora, he'd already begun to dislike this planet. A moment later, William came jogging back into view, and Darcy belatedly realized the Yucca had left. A toolbox that looked large enough to squash him rested on one shoulder, balanced there by his tail. When he reached Darcy, he started to chatter, stopped, frowned, tapped at his patch, and began again.
"I like to use my own tools, so I retrieve them. Thank you for selecting me, Captain Darcy. It's an honor to meet you, Captain. The news of the Battle of Allenham mentioned you several times. You were responsible for the destruction of more enemy ships than anyone else. You must be proud. It is fitting that you are here, since you are the best captain and Takatara is the best planet. We invented FDL travel. The enemy is the only other species that invented it, and we gave it to everyone else, which they did not. We invented patches. Everyone uses them. Well, I don't know about the enemy. Do you know if the enemy uses patches?"
Darcy shook his head, then realized that the Yucca might not understand, and said, "I haven't heard whether or not the enemy uses them." He'd thought he was getting the less chatty Yucca. "Should we?" he said, and began walking in the direction the ship and Elizabeth Bennet had gone.
"Oh, yes, we should,"
William agreed, pattering along at Darcy's side.
"Have to get the ambassador's ship fixed. It's an honor to work on. Once I was so privileged as to repair the Prime Minister of Takatara's private vessel, you know. She was so pleased with my work. I received a commendation. I can show you. I've looked it up. It is similar to your human designation of Sir. So I am now William Sir in the human language of English that you speak."
It would be Sir William, Darcy reflected, but felt no need to add to the conversation, which the euchre seemed quite able to carry on his own. William switched his patch to display his title.
"Does that translate to Sir? I could send it to your patch and you could check."
When Darcy didn't reply, William said,
"I suppose I can check myself because you are more interested in the repairs to the ship than my title."
Darcy wished he had a mechanic with him, but he'd left the Derbyshires on Brighton 4. Most FTL ships travelled without one, partially due to the difficulty of doing repairs in open space, and partially because the strict weight requirements didn't leave much room for spare parts, or spare crew members. As a battle-tested captain, however, Darcy found that a mechanic who could double up on other duties was a valuable addition to a crew. Though the SS Netherfield was an older, smaller model, she and the HMS Derbyshire were similar ships, though fitted out differently. The Derbyshire was meant for battle. She held 10 people, but people worked in shifts and shared bunks. She had weapons, extra shielding, and almost no personal space. The Netherfield was luxurious in comparison. But when they reached the hangar, William wasn't interested in the interior of the ship. In fact, he didn't make any move to enter the Netherfield. Instead, he first circumnavigated her, looking at the damaged hull, and commented they were lucky it wasn't breached. He then started working with easy confidence. His idle chatter was exchanged for speaking about what he was doing and what the results of his investigation showed. He observed that the Netherfield had taken the sort of large-scale external hull damage that was best addressed on the ground. It would take time, but not unusual skill. Finally, they entered the ship. After climbing about in spaces where humans didn't fit well, tutting, clicking, and chattering all the while, William told Darcy that he would run several specific, isolated diagnostics. Darcy followed William into the main part of the ship, his back, neck, and shoulders protesting as he drew upright to his full height again. He'd always been told it was better not to be tall if you wanted to be a pilot. Next, William led the way back outside, set down his tools, and, to Darcy's surprise, scuttled agilely up the side of the Netherfield. Though there were ladder rungs at various points, Darcy elected to remain on the ground. He didn't imagine he'd have any observations worth the effort of the climb. He'd just be in the way up there.
"Oh, not good, not good,"
William tutted, loud enough for Darcy to hear.
"Look at these blast points."
He scuttled back down, removed a monitor from his toolbox, and went up again. Darcy stood by the Netherfield and waited. Returning to the ground once more, William held out his monitor, presenting Darcy with the little screen, the readout in Takatari, and therefore meaningless to him.
"Your drive converter needs minor repairs, and 2 of the 3 inertia cancellers are useless."
Darcy knew they weren't working from the diagnostics. What he didn't know was how difficult the repairs would be. He had even less of an idea if the euchre, William, was up to the task. He seemed confident, but Darcy would feel better if Bennet would come take a look and give his opinion. His hands might shake too hard to hold a pulley wrench, but the man's patch said his mind was full of knowledge. "What's the diagnosis?" Darcy asked.
"Not looking good, Captain, I'm sorry to say."
"Can you fix the ship?" Darcy asked, trying to be clearer.
"Yes, but the inertia cancellers must be replaced."
"That shouldn't take long, should it?"
"Maybe half a day, but it will take 6 months to get replacements. We don't have enough for this ship in our bubble."
6 months? Darcy took a deep breath against his horror at the idea. Long before that, Darcy expected both the Derbyshire and her crew to be ready to fly back to Earth. As a member of the BIF, He couldn't simply remain on Takatara without orders to do so. If the repairs really took as long as William predicted, Bingley would have to find another pilot who wanted to go to Earth. Darcy dreaded to think what would take place if the British intergalactic force needed the Derbyshire ASAP, and his crew wasn't allotted time to fetch him. Would they give someone else his command? The Derbyshire was too new, too powerful a ship to let sit around. Darcy ground his teeth. He didn't want anyone else in command of his ship. He bit back a curse and drew in another steadying breath. 6 months